Dani, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me with you.
I want to start right away with the first question.
Sure.
How has populism manifested in Israeli politics historically, and are there specific events or periods that stand out? Can you provide insights into the historical roots and evolution of the radical right in Israel?
Okay. I think that the first populist moment was when Menachem Begin, who was the leader then of the Herut party, which is the main party of the coalition that became Likud party, which is the party now in government, sometime in the early mid-50s, 1950s, Begin led a transformation of the Likud party from a radical right avant-garde type of party to a populist party. Now, this process was a relatively prolonged one. It began in the, let's say, in the mid-50s, and it reached its peak when Likud arrived to government in 1977, winning for the first time the elections to the Labour Party, which was in government from 1948 until 1977. So this is a process, and Likud under Menachem Begin's leadership was a kind of sui generis type of populism. Why? Because it was a nationalist party. It was right wing in its conception of Israel and the commitment to the great Israel and the denial of the idea of a Palestinian people or a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. But it was in many ways also a kind of inclusive populism and not exclusionary populism, because it, for Jews that arrived to Israel from Arab countries, what are called in Hebrew Mizrahim, Oriental Jews, for them, Likud was an inclusive populist party. At the three levels of inclusion. It was symbolically inclusive because the narrative Begin created included the Oriental Jews as part of the common we, as part of the people, while they were much more excluded under labor. At the political level, they also become Mizrahi Jews became central leaders within Likud, ministers, members of the Knesset in a way, and also Oriental Jews as a collective subject became part of the Likud, what didn't exist during the days of Labour Party hegemony. And the third point there was some kind of material inclusion. There were in areas like housing and education, there were some measures that included Oriental Jews and improved their material situation.
All right.
So it was a kind, and also, so it was sui generis in, usually there is a kind of, a kind of commonality between left populism and inclusive populism and right-wing populism and exclusionary populism. In the case of Likud, it was sui generis because it was a right-wing populism, but with clear inclusionary characteristics, at least for Oriental Jews. Now, vis-a-vis Palestinian Israeli citizens, Likud was for sure not inclusive, but it was not more exclusionary than the Labour Party previously. So this is one type of change in the, or not change, or some kind of yes, not stereotypical type of populism in this sense. And the other point is that, you know, Takis Papas, and not only Takis Papas, define populism as anti-liberalism. Now, Likud was not, under Begin's leadership, was not anti-liberal. In fact, their view, for example, of the relationship between the juridical power and the executive, or the juridical power and the legislative power, was more of a conservative liberalism than a populist one. And this is, I think, because, as people like the early Laclau or Margaret Canavan described, many times populist ideology is framed as against the hegemonic ideology, the ideology of the powers that be. And since the Labour Party that was hegemonic until during the 50s and the 60s, it has a socialist rhetoric. It's not surprising that liberalism could be adopted, that a liberal rhetoric could be adopted by a populist anti-elitist party, because liberalism was an ideology that was opposed to the ideology of the then elites, or at least to the rhetoric of the then elites. So that made Likud under Begin a kind of sui generis populist party. Now, with Begin's abandonment of political life in 1982, there is a period of transition within Likud where there is an internal conflict between the more populist wing and the more conservative liberal wing. This period takes 10 years, between 1982 and 1992. And then in 1992, Netanyahu is elected as chairperson of the Likud. And Netanyahu, between 1992 and 2006, his project is that Likud will become a neoconservative party, as the Reagan's or George W. Bush's Republican Party. You know, radical neoliberal, nationalist, and realistic in terms of international politics, and culturally conservative. That was his project. That was his project between 1992 and 1996, when he prepared the Likud to return to government. That was his project as prime minister between 1996 and 1999. And that was also his project when he was replaced by Sharon as leader of the Likud, and was Sharon's Minister of Finance, and he performed the more radical neoliberal transformations within Israel.
Right.
For example, privatization of the pension system, and just as an example. But when Sharon splits from Likud in 2000, towards the 2006 elections, Sharon splits over because he wants to he's in favor of a retreat from the Gaza Strip, but a retreat without not an agreement but a one-sided unilateral retreat from the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu is against. He's on the right of Sharon in this theme, and he remains as chairperson of the Likud once again. And in the 2006 elections, Likud, headed by Netanyahu, gets only 12 seats in the Knesset. That's 10% of the vote. Those are the worst elections for Likud since the elections to the second Knesset in the early 50s.
All right.
And in my view, that's a personal interpretation. In my view, Netanyahu understands the limits of the neocon project in Israel, and then he begins the turn to a radical right exclusionary populist party. Now,
right.
He wasn't the pioneer of radical right populism in Israel. The pioneer was Avigdor Lieberman, who was a former Likud member. He was, when Netanyahu was elected chairperson of Likud in 1992, he appointed Lieberman as the CEO of the Likud, the principal executive. But in 1999, Lieberman splits from Likud and creates a party which is called Israel Our Home, which is a clear-cut exclusionary radical right-wing populist party. Even they have an observers at the EU radical right populist group in the European Parliament.
All right.
And eventually in the so he's the first with a clearly exclusionary rhetoric and policy against Israeli Palestinians. Lieberman is the first one to say that Israeli Palestinians are a worse threat for Israel than the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and with a populist rhetoric speaking about the people as against the oligarchy. He says we are not anti-elitist because elites are good, but there is not an elite, there is an oligarchy, and we are anti-oligarchics. So and Netanyahu began to adopt that rhetoric and that approach. And in fact, in 2013, both parties ran together in the 2013 elections. And it's not a success, even though Likud still manages to build a coalition, but the merging wasn't good. Lieberman eventually splits, but then Likud remains as the main radical right-wing populist party.
Can you please wrap up, Professor? We have so many questions.
Okay, so that is the second, and this is the actual moment when Likud has become a radical right-wing populist party, even an extreme radical right-wing populist party, with some members that I would say are almost close to fascism.
All right. Okay. The next question is, Professor, to what extent does populism in Israel intertwine with identity politics, particularly concerning issues such as nationality and religion? Are there populist narratives that specifically target or resonate with certain social groups?
Okay, so for sure, nationalism is nativism, as Kasmude calls it, is very, very central element of Likud's populism. The demonization of Israeli Arabs and the building of a chain of equivalences that says ISIS is like Iran, Iran is like Hezbollah, Hezbollah is like Hamas, Hamas is like the Palestinian autonomy, and the Palestinian autonomy is like Israeli Arabs, and Israeli Arabs is like the leftist traitors that support them. This is a chain of equivalences in which national identity is central. Now, as for the role of religion, that is more, it's an instrumental use of religion. There are, for sure, most Likud members are what we call in Hebrew Masortim traditionalist observant Jews, but they are not clearly religious. Many of them don't use kippah, don't cover their heads, and they respect some of the mandates of religion and some not. Religion is mostly used functionally as a form of differentiating between the in-group and the out-group. That's the reason that Likud is much more tolerant in issues as, for example, the LGBTQ community or women's rights than Orthodox religious parties.
All right. And how does the media landscape contribute to or counter populist narratives in Israeli politics? Have you identified any patterns in the use of media by populist and radical right figures?
Well, the use of social media is social media because of the algorithm and the business model is very supportive of populist leaders and of populist politicians. It allows a supposedly direct relationship between the leader and the people without the need of intermediate organization as political parties. It clearly differs between us and them. So yes, I think social media, and we see it everywhere from Trump in the US to other leaders, and Netanyahu in that sense is a kind of master in the use of social media.
Right. Israel started as a secular country, and the Zionist movement strongly supported the separation of church and state. Then religious populism gained ground and became so powerful today. What went wrong? How did religious populism become such a strong movement?
Well, I'm not sure Israel, there was no real, even though Zionism in its beginning at least had a strong socialist current, but already in 1948, when the Labour Party didn't succeed, or maybe didn't want to succeed in proclaiming a constitution that would establish, among other things, the separation between church and state. And in fact, because their political alliance with the National Jewish Religious Party, then they postponed the decisions about the relationships between state and religion. In fact, Israel does not have civil marriages, and it does not have in many areas, and thus it doesn't have civil divorce. In many areas, it left the decision about personal issues like marriages or funerals to the religious establishment. And there is a national rabbi which is funded by the state. So from the beginning, there was no real separation between state and church. And once again, I think that populism has a strong religious identity core in terms of establishing the difference between the in-group and the out-group. But Likud's populism is not a clear-cut religious populism. There is a party which is called Shas, which is an ultra-Orthodox party, which has had in the past, even more than today, very, very strong populist characteristics. But it's not the case for Likud. One of the Likud main leaders, for example, is a homosexual which has gone public with his homosexuality. So this shows that it's not a religious party. It has a strong core religious identity, but it's not a religious party with a clear-cut religious agenda, Likud. It's populism. It's like playing with religion in an instrumental way.
All right. In your article, Israel's right-wing populists and the European connection, you argue, I quote, the partnership between Netanyahu's Israel and Orban's Hungary is indicative of the enormous change that Israel has undergone during Netanyahu's era. Israel has become much more like Orban's Hungary, a right-wing populist, illiberal powerhouse, and it is not above joining forces with the European far right with anti-Semitism in its lineage. How do you explain this enormous change? What are the dynamics of this change, and how did Netanyahu achieve it?
Okay, I think that the change is part of a more global change with the strengthening of radical right populism in the States, in Europe. For Likud today, support for Israel policies vis-a-vis the Arab world and especially the Palestinian issue is much more important than the black anti-Semitic past of many of those leaders. That is true also about Meloni and the fascist past of her party, or Jean-Marie Le Pen, or Marine Le Pen and the anti-Semitic past of the Front National. So I think that geopolitics and for Likud, it's clear that it's much more important in the Likud worldview, their current commitment to exclusionary populism, to radical right populism, and radical right populists in Europe are very good allies in that sense. I think that this is even more clear with the closeness between Poland's PiS, and Likud, because they are the antagonism of the PiS to revise Poland's attitudes under the Nazi regime should be much more problematic for a Israeli party as Likud. But once again, it's more about the present than about the past. And why Likud is so strong? I think that it's the combination between and which groups. Yes, for sure, the main support for Likud are lower middle class and middle class and mobile middle class Oriental Jews. And in that sense, I think that the explanation is, for once, on the one hand, the loyalty of this social group to Likud, that for them was an instrument of social and political mobility, and also the fact that as he became more and more populist, Netanyahu was ready to adopt more heterodox economic policies and in a way deviate from his previous radical neoliberalism. And we can see that between 2009 and 2019, the decade in which Netanyahu was in power continuously, there was a process of social mobility even more for those groups. The minimum wage increased 38%, when the inflation, accumulated inflation, was no more than maybe 20%. So for the first time since the mid-80s, the Gini index decreased in Israel. For the first time since the mid-80s, the two lower quintiles improved vis-a-vis the two higher quintiles. So there were economic private consumption in Israel for the first time during those years was greater. The average private consumption was greater than the average consumption among OECD countries. So I think that part of the support for Netanyahu was the fact that those were years that, from a security point and the conflict, were relatively quiet, and from an economic point of view, they were positive for those social groups. Among them, Likud finds its main support.
All right. In the same article you mentioned, I quote, the ongoing Israeli colonialism in the occupied territories. Do you see Israel as a colonizer? If so, what role does religious populism play in colonizing Palestinian lands?
Well, I think that in those days, it's a tricky question, because I don't think that the decolonization process should include all Israel, as some of the supporters of Free Palestine from the Jordan to the sea claim. But I think that the politics within the occupied territories was a colonizer policy. And I think that there is a link between this kind of process and the strengthening of the radical right populism, which I think it's linked to process of colonization. Now, the main role in this process of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories is not that of Likud as a radical right populist party, but of the radical religious right, which is not populist at all. They have an avant-garde and in many ways anti-democratic conception of populism. My understanding of populism is that populism is democratic. It maybe supports a neoliberal form of democracy, but it isn't anti-democratic. For me, that's the reason that fascism can't be considered a form of populism, as many scholars do. In my view, those are two different phenomena. And I think that what is called now the party, which is called the Religious Zionist Party in Israel, is a kind of religious fascism, what some scholars call clerical fascism. And I think that the clerical fascism is the main supporter and the main subject in the colonization of the occupied Palestinian territories.
All right. And again, in the same article, you underlined that, I quote, Netanyahu has turned to nativism and xenophobia, mostly in the form of Islamophobia, end of the quote. What does this Islamophobic populism mean for the Israeli Arabs and the Palestinians?
Well, for the Israeli Arabs, it was their the denial of collective rights and the delegitimization of the Israeli Arab political leadership. Netanyahu has done it rhetorically many, many times. In the 2015 elections, he said, Jews come to vote because the Israeli Arabs are coming by their hundreds in buses paid by leftist NGOs. That was on election day. In one of the, between 2019 and 2021, we have 4 rounds of elections. In one of those rounds, he attempted to, Likud wanted to include cameras in the voting, in the ballot room, so as to combat fraud. But this was clearly focused against Israeli Arabs as a way to try to diminish the percentage of voting among Israeli Arabs. It was a kind of boomerang. And then in the next round of elections, he tried to mitigate this nativism, but once again, it appeared with all its strength in the last elections.
All right. And Professor, how do you explain the close relationship between Netanyahu's Likud and the far-right populist parties in Europe, like the Vlaams Belang in Belgium or the Freedom Party in the Netherlands?
Well, as I said before, for Likud, Likud is today a radical right populist party. Its messages are not different from those of Vlaams Belang of Freedom Party. And I think that Islamophobia in many ways Islamophobia in many ways replaces the traditional role of anti-Semitism from the radical right in Europe. So they can be like brothers in their Islamophobia.
All right. And what do you think about
Islamophobia trumps anti-Semitism? And since Islamophobia trumps anti-Semitism, that justifies their closeness.
Right, right. What do you think about the fate of the so-called judicial reform being pushed by Netanyahu? Do you think the Israeli people will agree to it?
Well, it was contested even before. As you probably know, there were huge demonstrations against, and the country was split. I think that after the massacre of the 7/11 and 7/10, the 7th of October, and the current war in Gaza, I think that it represents the end of Netanyahu's primacy in Israeli politics. I think that I hope that the war will end as soon as possible, but I think that with the end of the war, Netanyahu will fall. and I think that the juridical reform is dead.
All right. Okay. How does the current war with Hamas will impact the populist movements in Israel? Some argue that the era of Netanyahu is about to end. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that we will have the Netanyahu era. I think arrived to an end, but I think that clerical fascism will remain strong, and I think that in Israel, as in many democratic countries, populism is the results from the blind points and lack of self-criticism of liberalism, and mainly because of the connection between liberalism and neoliberalism. And since I'm not optimistic that liberals will become more self-critical, and because neoliberalism still seems strong, I think that the basic causes for the emerging of populism, and in Israel as radical right populism, will remain. I think they will receive a blow, and the end of Netanyahu's age will mean a loss of power for radical right populism in the short hand. In the mid and long term, if there won't be changes in the economic policy, in the socio-economic policies, and if there won't be some kind of change in the reality of conflict, if there won't be a peace process towards a just peace in the Middle East that contemplates the rights, the collective rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, I think that the result will be a re-emergence of radical right populism.
All right. And lastly, Professor, do you believe that the recent conflict in Gaza could potentially trigger a wave of civilizational populism beyond Israel and Palestine, and even beyond MENA region? How would you characterize this wave, as civilizational populism or a clash of civilizations?
Well, I don't think that, once again, not all the right wing is populist. I'm much more afraid of clerical fascism and from fascism than from right wing populists. And clerical fascism or religious fundamentalism does not have to be populist and is very dangerous. I hope that, as I said, the war will end as soon as possible, and I think that that could avoid a kind of expansion and civilizational clash that would only broaden the circles of death and destruction. I think that we need the war to end as soon as possible and be replaced by an understanding that the only alternative for Palestinians and Israelis and for the region as a whole is an agreement that respects the rights of both people to self-determination and to live in security and with their collective and individual rights respected.
Professor Filc, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
All the best for you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.